As I said, today is a special day for us, and I want to give Colby a proper introduction this morning. And to do that, I want to read a message that I received this week. And the timing of this message is amazing. And I thought there's no way, after getting a message like that, or like this week, with perfect timing, that I can't read it, because it tells the story of why having Colby here to speak today is more meaningful than any other guest speaker we could have. It shows the story of how something is happening that's a bit full circle today. And so I want to read this Facebook message. He says some nice things. He's not just saying them to me. He's saying them to the One Church family. He's saying them to somebody whose name is in the message, and he's saying them to our guest speaker today as well. So I got a Facebook message this week from a guy named John in Missouri. A guy I've never met, but he watched a sermon online. He says, "Hey, I don't know you and you don't know me, but I was doing some research on biblical slavery, trying to get all the facts. So along with my study of the Bible itself, I also downloaded random podcasts that address the issue, and I happened to download the One Church sermon about slavery and homosexuality. I gave a sermon comparing both of those in the Bible and how we interpret the Bible." He says some nice things. "Out of all the lectures and sermons I listened to, yours was easily the most honest. It was really pathetic how some apologists and pastors try to tiptoe around the issue. You took the issue head on with honesty." And again, he's writing this to all of us because we're a congregation that does this. And he says, "I kept listening and I was blown away by your message on how people who are gay are to be treated." Now, check this out. "The story of Dina was very emotional to me." Where's Dina? Right there's Dina. He wrote, "The story of Dina was very emotional to me. And your stance at the end was both brave and empowering. I just wanted to friend you so you would get this message. Okay, now listen to this next line. "There are a lot of people who have strong feelings about how to treat people who are gay, and they would disagree with mine, and they would disagree with the position of One Church and of our guest speaker, but they would talk a lot about evangelism and winning souls to Christ." You know what I mean? Listen to this next line. "I have been an atheist for nearly 5 years. And your sermon on slavery and homosexuality was the most honest and moving sermon I've heard in a long, long time. Keep up the good work, man." And so he's not just sending that to me, like I said. He's sending that to the entire One Church community. And here's why he's also sending it to our guest speaker today. Because Dina, whom he refers to, used to be a part of the church that our guest speaker used to serve in. And when Colby had the courage to take a stand for what he believes, she saw what happened to him, and there are others here who experienced that. And she decided that maybe it wasn't the best place for her. And we started this church in March of 2013, and right before that, Dina saw like a newspaper ad and emailed me and basically asked, would my family be accepted in your church? And I said yes. And so Dina is like a superstar in One Church now, right? The rest is One Church history. But that shows how our guest speaker's courage led to Dina, which led to One Church. And so when I and my wife moved here 2.5 years ago to start this church, I just kept hearing this name Colby. Like everywhere I go, like Colby this, Colby that. This guy Colby. It was just like this thing that was in the water in the Southeast Valley. And I started to probe and ask questions. And I gradually heard the story. And I made it a personal goal. Just being very honest with you right now. How great would it be if sometime in some way this guy would have an opportunity to talk and share his story and share how he's doing, because he's still kicking and he's alive and well. Amen? And he could have kind of a homecoming experience back here in the Southeast Valley of Phoenix. So I asked him to write a bio that I could read as a formal introduction, and here it is. 8 months ago, Colby and his wife Kate finally embarked on their dream to plant a church that they would actually want to go to and raise their 4 boys in. Sojourn Grace Collective began in March with a vision to be San Diego's progressive Christian church, empowering people to orient their lives around the kingdom of Jesus by loving God and loving others, flowing from a healthy love of ourselves. For the past 10 years, Colby has been a worship pastor at churches in Salem, Oregon, and San Diego, as well as spending 5 years here in the desert at a nearby church. One of Colby's primary areas of engagement within Christianity right now is to challenge the ways the church has understood the Bible with regards to homosexuality, and to call out the reality that all people have a place at God's table. All are part of the family. Regardless of the bruises Colby has received from the church over the years, some of which you'll hear about this morning, he still believes that the bride of Christ has a beautiful calling in the world to carry on Christ's work of love, mercy, reconciliation, and grace for all people. Finally, of lesser import, Colby is an NFL junkie, has a perpetual sweet tooth, spends far too much money on hair products, drinks water, coffee, beer, and whiskey, and doesn't understand why everybody's favorite movie isn't Lord of the Rings. Everybody, please, let's give a very warm welcome to our guest, Colby Martin. Come on up, man.
Appreciate it, man. Thanks, brother. Hey, friends. Hey, friends. Hey. It's good to be here. What an introduction. Thank you, Ryan. Thank you, One Church, for letting me come. I'll just keep talking and let the sound engineer get that ring out for all of us. I tend to think the introduction is the most interesting part of a sermon. My wife continues to remind me, Colby, it's not. Like, you really could just take out most of your introductions and your sermon would still be great. So in the interest of time, I'm just going to take out my introduction and get right to it with you. Is that okay? Is that okay? All right, you are out there. Now, you're in this series called Selfie, right? So is there any way to bring up house lights? Can I get a quick selfie with One Church in the back? Because that just seems to make sense to me. So house lights. Okay, so One Church, are you ready? On the count of 7. 1, no, I'm just kidding. All right, we have now been selfied together, so thank you for that. Turn to your neighbor real quick, give him a high five, and say, if I looked like you, I would probably take more selfies. Go ahead, turn to your neighbor, high five, say, if I looked like you, I probably would take more selfies. So there's this thing about the selfie, right, where most people seem to scoff at the selfie, that it's this, it shows vanity. It plays into our narcissistic culture a little bit. But for me, I think that's kind of a cynical, maybe narrow-minded view of the selfie. I think there's maybe a little bit more going on in that moment of reach, turn, flip, click, post. Okay? A friend of mine the other day who self-admittedly takes a lot more selfies than the average person, he pushed back on exactly this point. And he argued that for him, growing up in a religious environment suffocated him with a lot of shame. And he had this unhealthy sense of self-loathing where if you do something well or accomplish something wonderful, you cannot take pride in it or feel good about it. And so in many ways, for my friend, taking selfies is a way for him to celebrate what he sees as the beautiful image of God in him. And so my buddy Matthew wrote this. He said, I believe God fully supports the kind of celebration that says, this is me. I love this facet of myself. I love my smile, my eyes, my laugh. I think I have something to offer the world just by being myself, and I'm not afraid to offer it. So I wonder then if we might discover this strange but beautiful juxtaposition of the selfie, where on one hand it kind of plays into this narcissistic culture, embodying all the ego, and on the other hand it sort of has this self-expression of this is me, and on some level I'm proud of me, and I want to be okay with that, and I want to share that with the world. When Ryan graciously invited me to come share with you and told me, the series that you're in, it immediately clicked with me to take this idea of selfie and to look back on the last 3 years of my life, as though I'm taking a selfie of the last 3 years. You've been using this quote from Socrates, right? An unexamined life is not worth living, and so I wonder what does it look like if I were to examine these last 3 years? What are some of the things that I could draw from it? Because to be honest with you, who I am today, I like a whole lot more than who I was 3 years ago. But that would not be the case if it wasn't for what I've endured the last 3 years. Does that make sense? Does that make sense? Hi, are you out there? Are you with me? I'm just going to keep on doing that. If you don't answer me the first time, I will ask you a second time. So if you'll indulge me, I want to share with you a bit about these last 3 years, some of the significant moments And as I examine it, I hope there's something to offer you in your story that might be impactful or profound or encouraging or empowering. Let me say one more quick word of prayer, and then we're going to jump in. And so, God, this moment for me is all sorts of beautiful. And so with a posture of gratitude and humility, and in the words of Elizabeth Gilbert, I attempt not to be original, but to be authentic. And so, God, I ask if anything that I say today is good or valuable or helpful or truthful, may it stick to our skulls, may it resonate in our hearts. But God, if anything I say is untrue or unhelpful or hurtful, may we forget it the minute we hear it. And so may the words of my mouth and the meditations of my heart be pleasing to you, O God. Amen. I'm glad this day finally came. These 6 words for me were the beginning of the end. It was Tuesday night, September 20th, 2011, and President Obama had just signed the repeal of Don't Ask, Don't Tell, the military ban against gays and lesbians serving in the military. And after I had read an article on the interwebs announcing that this repeal had happened, I went to my Facebook page and I shared an article and I wrote, "I'm glad this day finally came." And I clicked post. Now, to understand why this was the beginning of the end, I should probably back up a couple years. As Ryan mentioned in my introduction, my family and I moved here to the Chandler Gilbert area and worked for about 5 years at a local church. And we came from Oregon, where we were both born and raised. And when we moved here in 2006, we were completely unaware of 2 things. One of those things we were unaware of was how politically conservative much of Arizona is. And 2, we were unaware of the trajectory of our own journeys. So after just a couple years here in the valley, we watched as our own beliefs and convictions and views began drifting further and further away from sort of this brand of conservative evangelical Christianity. And this increasingly put us and put me in some rather muddy waters as I experienced the climate in which I was doing ministry to be less and less in line with where I was heading theologically, if that makes sense. One of your mottos here at One Church, which I love, is questions and doubts welcome. And for me, that was not my experience in my previous place of employment. My questions and doubts would not have been welcome, and especially if I had convictions that were different in some significant areas. And in particular, one of the areas that my wife and I moved on theologically while we were here was this issue of human sexuality. And we came to see things like, how people don't choose their orientation. We came to see things like how there are people that exist in the world that identify as gay or lesbian and also identify as Christian. Like, those people are real, like they're flesh and blood, they exist. We came to see how there was just a few verses in the Bible that people have used historically to sort of condemn our LGBT brothers and sisters. And we came to see there's some other ways to think about that. How did we never see this before? Now, of course, as we were moving on this journey, Kate and myself, we didn't talk about it to people. The climate we were in wasn't necessarily safe to have these sort of dialogues with people, so we kept it to ourselves. But eventually, we got to a point where we just discovered, you know what, I no longer believe that the Bible condemns homosexuality. I no longer believe that God is against people born of same-sex attraction. And I no longer believe that being gay or being lesbian was automatically disallowed you from being a member of the kingdom of God. Now, to be sure, there was, I'm working at this church, and there was enough overlap in some of the bigger mission and vision areas of the church that I was still able to engage in ministry. And I never did anything, in my opinion, that sort of taught a counter or violated the vision or the mission of the church. But slowly, the weight began to shift, and the things that we held in common were becoming less and less, and the areas of difference were becoming more and more. I felt a bit like a balloon. And with with everything that I sort of landed on with a different conviction, I was blowing air into this balloon, but I never had an outlet for it. And I just felt like it's going to burst eventually, right? There was no outlet. So then back to September 20th of 2011. I think that me saying, I'm glad this day finally came, even though in part I was speaking out against discrimination, which our church was all about, against discrimination, and I was naive and didn't necessarily understand that this issue was that politically charged. I was naive, I get it now. But in part I was like, this is great, it's the end of discrimination. But I think also there was maybe a subconscious part of me that couldn't handle the tension anymore and had to let a little bit of air out of the balloon, or else it was going to explode. But little did I know that this, what I thought rather innocuous post, would lead to the unraveling of everything. The next day I get to work and come to find out there was a barrage of emails and texts and phone calls to the lead pastor and the chair of the board, and people were wondering, why is Colby supporting gay rights? People were furious that a pastor would be pro-homosexuality. People were demanding my head. And so an emergency board meeting was called for on that Friday, and I was brought in to give an account of my beliefs regarding homosexuality, and I sat in a room with 8 other men and shared with them what I thought. I mean, these are things that I hadn't even told many of my own family members, right? And I didn't soften it. I didn't shy away from speaking my truth. If any of you watch The Good Wife, you have really good taste. But if any of you watch The Good Wife, you might have seen a couple weeks ago that Alicia Florrick, the main character, she's running for state's attorney. And she's about to go on an interview with a pastor, and her campaign knows that the pastor is going to talk about the fact that Alicia is an atheist, because the show, conveys that several times. And so they're saying, Alicia, you can't go on there and say you don't believe in God. She says, why not? I don't believe in God. And they say, if you do that, people will not elect you. You have to say things like, I'm not really settled on the issue. I'm kind of still exploring a little bit. And going into this meeting, this board meeting on Friday, I had people give me similar advice. Colby, you can't tell them you're firm on this. Just tell them you're still searching, you're not certain yet. And it might have allowed me to keep my job, but at what cost, right? So going into that meeting, I was firmly resolved that if I was asked the question, I would answer it honestly and truthfully. And I did. I went through that meeting on Friday. They told me, don't come on Sunday to lead worship. We'll have someone cover for you. And then I was invited back on Tuesday and handed my letter of termination. And so after 5 years of pouring some blood, sweat, and tears into this church, building relationships, beautiful relationships, helping to create and curate ministries, helping to define and create the culture and the value system of the church, helping it grow in some pretty significant ways, I was fired eventually because I did not believe it was a sin to be gay. I wasn't teaching this position. I wasn't talking to people about it. In fact, other than some conclusions and assumptions people might make from that Facebook post, there was no reason to think or believe that Colby somewhere in his brain thought this way. And on top of that, the church didn't really have a position on the issue. They didn't talk about it. They didn't teach about it. And yet, just me being there, my presence, knowing that this was kind of what I thought, was too much for some people. I tell you that story, but it's not at all to suggest that this church is not full of wonderful people, because there's wonderful, wonderful people. This isn't about people, right? This is about systems and theologies. And if I'm angry at anything, I'm angry at this stream of Christianity that has flowed for far too long. And so these people were just living into the convictions that they had as best as they knew how. Okay? And yet, I get fired, and my wife and I and our 3.5 boys had to do something. And we had to sell our home that we had bought and built. And we had to throw our dog and our 2 fish and my mom into a van and drive back home to Oregon, to our home state, and sort of lick our wounds and try to figure out what in the world is next. At that time, I didn't really know what my options were. I felt like I had 2 options. I could either go back into the theological closet, right, sort of polish off my resume and go look for some other worship gig at some other evangelical church, I felt that was one option, but I didn't want to do that. And so my other option is like, or I could become an Episcopal priest, because at least there I could be theologically open, but their sort of style and way of doing church just doesn't connect with me. And so I was really, for that 6 months in Oregon, I was depressed. I kind of gave up on God, gave up on Bible, gave up on prayer, and just sort of leaned into this angst of what in the world do I do next? During that time, I heard from several different people about this church in San Diego with two of the pastors who were gay, and so they said, you've got to get in touch with this church in San Diego. And so it's a beautiful story of how that all worked out, but that's for a whole other day. But eventually, after 6 months, my wife and I, and at this time 4 boys, moved down to San Diego to join this church where I could be the worship and arts pastor once again. And this church in San Diego showed me the unicorn does exist. Right? That there are churches that are theologically progressive and are still oriented around the person of Christ and the kingdom, and who do church in the style that I know and love. Like, oh, those churches do exist. I read a Vicky Beeching quote this week. If you know Vicky Beeching, she's a Christian pop singer from the UK, and she recently came out of the closet. And she said, the churches that feel like home, with music and drums and singing, their theology is not my theology. It actually tends to be the most traditional high church places, which have a more liberal outlook. She said, I've yet to find a guitar and drums church which aligned with my theology. I've yet to find the unicorn church. And this church in San Diego was a guitar and drums church that was open and affirming and chasing after the mission of Jesus, and it was wonderful and beautiful. But after about a year there, after the honeymoon period ended, I became very disillusioned. And I'll just say this. I had discovered after the dust had settled that I was in a place working with some people who had very different values than I did. And I have no interest in airing dirty laundry. That's not the point. The specifics are not what's important here. But I became very uncomfortable with some of the behaviors and the values and the decisions that were being made. In this church, some of what it meant or looked like to be a pastor didn't, for me, reflect what I see it means to shepherd people. Now, I'm not at all saying that pastors have to be perfect. I don't demand perfection from a pastor for anybody. We're all messed up in our own ways. We're all going to make mistakes no matter how hard we try. But for me, I discovered a pattern, a history of things that I learned had been there since the church started 8 years ago, but had never been brought to the light, never been talked about. So I faced a dilemma. Either I keep my head down, shut my mouth, keep on collecting a paycheck, perhaps while looking for work elsewhere, and just continue to watch as people were getting used and abused, and others were getting burned out, and others were suffering due to some really questionable decisions made with no accountability. Essentially, I could just abandon the ship of this church with some amazing people, but just say, you know what, I'll let you go on with your own trajectory and continue the pattern of crash and then fall out, broken lives, rebuild, and start over. Or I could try and ask some really hard questions and challenge the status quo and toil to try to redirect the ship so that it wasn't just surviving, but actually thriving. And sadly, this did play into my Superman complex a little bit, right? I do have a little bit of that in me of like, I can go in and save stuff. But at the core, this was about me being a part of a system, an organization that was living by and operating under some values that deeply rubbed up against some of my core convictions. So in the best way that I knew how, I tried to salvage what was breaking fast, what was breaking quickly. So I spoke with just the leadership of the church, some of the staff and the board, and we tried for several months to navigate through some of these treacherous waters, unearthing these patterns and histories of dysfunction and abuse and unhealthy leadership. But in the end, the powers that be ultimately decided to stick with the status quo and be content to repeat history, which sadly is what they're doing in this moment. So in February of this year, I was once again brought into an emergency board meeting, and once again I was terminated effective immediately. And I became just the next person in the line of this sort of scattered bodies along the road that tried to speak out, only to be discarded. Anybody ever taken a spiritual gifts assessment? 4 people. There you go. Some of you are like, I don't really want to raise my hand. He's not really curious. Actually, I'm curious. Have you ever seen on a spiritual gifts assessment the spiritual gift of getting fired from churches? If not, I present you Exhibit A. Like, it exists. I have this gift of getting fired from churches. And even after my wife and I started one, I'm still not convinced that it's not ultimately going to come back and get me again. My gift will emerge once again. 2 churches in 2 years. One because I held different beliefs about people born of same-sex attraction. The other because I held different ideas as to what was healthy and wise and good for pastors and what was ultimately going to help or hurt the church. And yet, just 2 weeks after getting fired, yet a second time, my wife and I came to face the realization that maybe now is the moment, the time for us to step out into our dream that we'd had for 5 years. For 5 years, Kate and I have wondered, what might it look like if we planted a church that we would get excited about going to and get excited about raising our kids in? Now, it's not that we think we're anything extraordinary. We're not. And it's not that we have anything magical to offer that hasn't already been done. We don't. And quite frankly, there's a lot of good reasons why planting a church in San Diego is a really bad idea. But this call to create a community that was committed to the ways of Jesus, this call to build an authentic and honest faith community, this call to be a place that was open and affirming, this call to be a place where families could come and worship together. This call to be a church that fell maybe on the more progressive end of the spectrum. This call to build a church that wasn't focused on one person, but had a shared leadership, an egalitarian model representing women and men in leadership equally. This call to foster relationships between people from all different walks of life and manifest this strange and yet beautiful reality of all humanity walking in unity towards love and peace and hope and justice and equality. This call in our hearts was loud. But what was even louder, I'll tell you this, what was even louder were the voices around us of about a dozen people that said, if you do this, if you stay here and start something, we're with you. We're with you. We got your back. And it's hard to describe what that's like if you've never had it. To have people in your life who believe in you and support you and encourage you to live into all of who you are, it could be one of the most powerful forces on earth. And so in early March, my wife and I told these handful of people that, yes, let's do this. We're ready to jump in head first to this thing. And so together we formed Sojourn Grace Collective, San Diego's progressive Christian church. For the first 3 months, we met in our living room. We went from about 23 people to 60 people, and eventually we had to move to an elementary school. And so now after 8 months, we're a church of about 90 people who meet together every week to worship Jesus and learn what it means to love God, love each other, love ourselves in a healthy way. About half of our church identify as gay or lesbian. About half of the church is non-white. Almost 1/3 of the 90 people are kids. We have people from all across the age spectrum, all across the political spectrum, all across the religious spectrum. We are truly a collective of people unified by grace, being honest about the sojourns in our life and being there to walk with others through theirs. And I got to tell you, I saw some friends as they were walking in this morning. I got to tell you, like I said to them, I have never felt more simultaneously alive and exhausted. It is so incredibly energizing to live into who you are and to do what you are at the core of your being designed to do. It's incredibly exhausting, but also simultaneously energizing, and it's beautiful, and I love it. It's electrifying every Sunday. So I'll tell you this, there may not be a whole lot of us out there, the unicorn churches, like Sojourn Grace and like One Church. The guitar and drum churches, that Vicky said. But the landscape is changing. The horizon looks hopeful, and I'm grateful that you exist. And that we can, out in San Diego, know that we're not alone in this effort to show a fresh side of the love of God. Are you with me? Amen. Okay. Now, I got a little bit of time left. And what I want to do is I want to go back then to this theme of selfie, and I want to examine with you these 3 acts of my story that I just shared with you, okay? And specifically what I want to talk about is integrity. Say that with me, integrity. Integrity. A little bit louder. Integrity. There you go. Now, there's 2 different definitions for integrity. The first, and perhaps the most common, is this: the quality of being honest and having strong moral principles. Synonyms are honesty, ethics, virtue, truthfulness. The second definition of integrity goes a little something like this: the state of being whole and undivided. Synonyms like unity and cohesion and togetherness. Think of it like this: your outsides are matching up with your insides. Or perhaps you could say it like this: integrity is the process of aligning your external actions with your internal convictions. There's a trajectory of cohesion, of wholeness between who I want to be and who I'm actually becoming. I meet with a spiritual director about once a week, and he had me go through this exercise of creating a timeline of all the significant events and people and moments in my life. And one of the goals of the timeline was to look back and say, what are some of the values that show up in your life? Not perceived values, like you may think, I value serving the poor, but if your timeline doesn't reflect that at all, it's just a perceived value. So you look at the timeline, and as we're looking at my timeline together, one of the things that surprised me, and it was my spiritual director that pointed this out, was how much integrity came up over and over and over again in my timeline. Not necessarily the first definition of integrity. Sure, I might enjoy, ethics and morals as much as the next guy, but it was more this second understanding of integrity. That was this common thread throughout my timeline, and suddenly things clicked, came into focus. It's kind of like that moment in Fight Club, right? Which is where your minds went instantly as I was talking about this. That moment where the narrator, played by Edward Norton, discovers that, spoiler alert, but come on, it's 20 years old, that he and Brad Pitt, Tyler Durden, are the same. He is Tyler Durden. And instantly you think back, oh yeah, that's why nobody ever talked to Tyler directly. And oh yeah, that's why Tyler kept telling the Edward Norton character, don't ever tell Marla about me. And everything came into focus. And so this concept of integrity was like my Fight Club moment. And so I have 4 characteristics, real quick, that I think integrity demands of us. And this is what I want to leave you with. Just sharing with you my story is sometimes fun and good and all that, but let me leave you with something that I hope can make a profound impact in your life. So real quickly, 4 things that I think integrity demands. That is, we seek to align our convictions with our actions, that we might actually find ourselves needing to embody these things. The first is this: sometimes integrity invites you to be patient. Sometimes integrity invites you to be patient. This series is called Selfie, No Filter, but honestly, doesn't life sometimes hand you a filter, whether you want it or not? And sometimes I wonder, maybe we have divine permission to accept the filter for a little while, to live with this tension between our convictions and our actions, to live with it in sort of a faithful patience. Here's what I mean. That season in my life, specifically 2010 and 11, where there was a lot of tension between my convictions and the place I was working, was incredibly challenging for me. And some days I didn't think I was going to make it. This morning, before I came here, I went to the coffee shop at Agritopia, and I was just kind of going over some thoughts. And I remembered, oh yeah, there was one morning 4 years ago where I left a meeting, got in my car, and just started weeping. Just uncontrollably weeping in my car, because I thought, I don't know if I can keep doing this. I'm in such a different place. And so anyways, I'm just reflecting on this and that time there where I was in such a tension-filled season of life. And yet I can see how integrity was inviting me to be patient. There's a story in 2 Kings chapter 5, the story of Naaman. Do you guys know the story of Naaman? So Naaman has leprosy. He's a commander of a pagan army, and he comes to Israel hoping that a prophet of Israel can heal him of his leprosy. And Elisha says, okay, Naaman, go dip in the Jordan River 7 times and you'll be clean. Naaman does that, dips in the Jordan, comes back, he's clean. And here's what Naaman says to Elijah when he comes back clean. Verse 15, then Naaman and all his attendants went back to the man of God, back to Elijah. He stood before him and he said, now I know that there is no God in all the world except Israel. Naaman had this profound conviction that there is one God, and it's the God of Israel, not his God where he came from, the God of Ramon. But then something remarkable happened. The story keeps going. And he gets ready to go home. Naaman gets ready to go home, and he says this to Elijah. He says, verse 18, but may the Lord forgive your servant, speaking of himself, for this one thing. When my master enters the temple of Ramon to bow down, and he's leaning on my arm, and I have to bow down there also. When I bow down in the temple of Ramon, may the Lord forgive your servant for this. In other words, look, I am totally with you, Elijah. Ramon is not real. The one true God is here in Israel. I'm all sold out. I'm all in. But here's the deal. I still have to go back and do my job. And if I go back and start talking about the God of Israel, me and my family, we're going to get killed. I'll promise you that. So even though my convictions are here, I need to go back and maybe still live like I used to live. So how do you think God's going to feel about that, Naaman said? And you know what Elisha says, right? Elisha says, "You coward! Don't you know that anything that is not of faith is sin?" He doesn't say that. Elisha says, "How dare you, Naaman? Even if you get killed, you must only obey the one true God." He doesn't say that. He says, "You fraud. You must not really believe in the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, or you'd never enter the temple of Rimmon again." He doesn't say that. He says this, "Go in peace. Go in peace." An unbelievable blessing from Elisha that gives Naaman this divine blessing to live with the tension between his inside convictions and his outward actions. And I leaned heavily on this story in those moments where I wondered, what am I doing still working here when so much of what I believe is different from everyone else? But sometimes integrity's voice whispers to us, "Patience, dear child. I know you have these convictions bubbling up inside of you, and one day you'll be able to soar, I promise. But for now, see if you can discipline yourself and pursue harmony and reconciliation with others and learn what it means to live with this tension inside of you." That being said, I don't think we are meant to live forever out of alignment, to be out of cohesion with our convictions. So that leads me to the second thing that I've learned about integrity, and it's this. Integrity takes courage. Sometimes, or perhaps most of the times, it's easier to keep that filter on. And this was the choice that I had going into that first board meeting. But living in a peaceable way, while not fully disclosing all my convictions, is entirely different from being asked a direct question about those convictions and not giving an honest answer. You see the difference there? Do you see the difference there? I'll just say it again. Living in a peaceable way while not fully disclosing all of my convictions is entirely different from being asked a direct question about those convictions and not giving an honest answer. And that takes courage, to take the filters that the world hands you and say, "Not this time. Not this time. I'm good. Though I might lose friends, though I might lose status or my job, I am convinced that the way of Jesus involves integrity, involves lining up actions with my convictions." So if you're asking me, then yes, here I am. This is me, all of me, no filter. And I wish I could tell you that when I did that in that moment, like the heavens opened up and angels started singing and clapping and everything was like, bluebird on my shoulder singing and it was beautiful, but it wasn't that. It wasn't that. That wasn't the reality. The peace that comes when we align our external actions with our internal convictions, that would eventually come, but it didn't happen right away. Instead, there was pain and confusion and fear. And yet I was starting to recognize the voice of integrity a bit more. So that when I was at the church in San Diego, I believe I was more quickly able to hear her voice. Which leads me to the third thing I'll say about integrity. It's this, that the path to wholeness always goes through bravery. If courage is being able to answer honestly when asked something of you, then bravery is being willing to speak up when no one's asking. In San Diego, I found myself in a place where what I believed to be true about things like shepherding a church and caring for people and being a spiritual leader, these convictions were constantly being warred against by external forces. And I could feel myself starting to get out of alignment again. But this time, integrity was whispering, don't ignore those convictions. Walk forward in truth. Do it humbly, in grace, seeking peace as best as possible, but you need to speak up, or slowly your soul is going to start to wither. It's like Sarah Bareilles says, "And since your history of silence won't do you any good, did you think it would? Let your words be anything but empty. Why don't you tell them the truth? I want to see you be brave." Right? Just an incredibly empowering song. And so in both of these cases in this church, what drove me was this desire for integrity. This incessant calling to line up my actions with my convictions. Being whole and cohesive and being together is huge for me, and I think it's huge for humanity. as well. When your insides and your outsides are not aligned, then I found that peace is very hard to come by. That joy can be short-lived, that hope feels forever beyond reach. Here's the thing. This is where I'm like really constricted by this mark, because Ryan said if you go past this, you're going to be in the shadows and the camera's going to get really ugly. But just picture me like coming right into your faces right now. You got it? I'm in your face. That guy's like, no, do not get in my face. I do not want that. Picture me just right with you saying this. I believe that inside each and every one of you, there exists a you that God is calling out. Inside each and every one of you, there exists a you that God is calling out. You bear the image of God, the imprint of the divine. You're a son or a daughter of the King. And that part of you is being invited by God to work its way to the surface and to shine bright. So bright. And along the way in our lives, if we are faithfully following the journey that Christ is taking us on, we might come to these moments of realizations, these moments of awareness, of transformation, where things might seem a bit out of alignment, our convictions with our actions. The question is, are we living into them? Do our external lives match up with our internal convictions? The God that is growing inside of you, God is growing to you inside of you, are you allowing that to come to the surface? That's a life of integrity, that's a life of wholeness. And your soul withers if that disconnect is allowed to take shape. Maybe for a season you can withstand it like I did at the first church. Maybe for a season you're aware of this certain divine permission to live with attention and joyful patience. But eventually something will break because the human is not meant to be out of alignment, out of wholeness, out of integrity. Maybe you're in a context right now where you're asked every day to take part of something that is slowly sucking your soul. And you go to bed exhausted from having sludged through yet another day, and you're anxious about waking up and having to do it all over again. What if the voice of integrity is inviting you now to step out in courage and bravery and faith, believing that the author of your faith who's brought you to these convictions will carry you through as you stumble towards living them out? Like Paul said, God began a good work in you. God's going to finish the good work in you. There's all sorts of really good reasons why starting a church in San Diego is a really bad idea for us. It's the fourth most expensive city in the United States. We have 4 small boys. For 10 years, we've lived on a one-income family. The type of church that we want to curate, and like you're trying to curate here, doesn't really have a large audience to draw from. If we wanted to sell certainty and fear and shame, there's a lot of people that want to buy that. But the sliver of the people that are looking for these sort of types of churches is not as big of a sliver as we would like. And so that the possibility to grow a church becomes even more challenging. And yet, no matter how scary it is, no matter how absurd it might have been for us, no matter how hard it could be or the number of reasons not to do it, it once again came down to integrity. And that's the last thing I want to share with you. Integrity is an invitation to trust in the convictions that God brings you to. Integrity is an invitation to trust. And so when yet another church board said to me, no, we don't want you here anymore, my wife and I, we grabbed each other's hands and we said, an adventure, my love? Always, my love. So I ask, is there something inside of you that for months or years or decades has been begging to come out? Something that in your quietest, most stillest moments seems actually possible, but when life starts to get a little bit shaky, you're like, no, I could never do that. Is there something that you knew if you couldn't fail at it, then you would do it immediately? Is there something right now, is there a disconnect between your internal convictions and your inner desires and your external actions? Is the voice of integrity whispering to you even in this moment? Or maybe it's shouting, like getting fired from 2 churches in 2 years. Maybe it's shouting. Please listen to me, the voice says. The eternal divine light inside of you is trying to get out. Trust me, the voice of integrity says. I won't lead you astray. I won't. It's not that it's going to be easy. In fact, I can guarantee it won't. It's not that it'll be fun, at least not right away perhaps. But you can trust me. You can trust these convictions that I've laid upon your heart. You can trust them. Because this is the path to integrity, to wholeness. And it will lead you to the abundant life that Jesus has come to give. I believe that walking faithfully along the journey that Christ is leading you is one of the most important things you can do. Not everyone's going to like it. There might be those that encourage you to just keep it to yourself, focus on what there is instead of on what there could be. There might be those that encourage you to just keep your head down, don't rock the boat, don't speak up. And when you do, they'll accuse you of judging people or being holier than thou or being arrogant or selfish or whatever. But my friends, your obligation is not to them, it's to the person inside of you that Jesus is desperately trying to call out.